Good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day it is for
Whatever time
you.
zone you're in. Hi, gang.
That's it. Maggie and I not in the same time zone anymore, so we're being
I know, I'm
flexible.
finally back in the UK. And look, finally hung pictures behind me.
There we go. There we go. It's not
Oh,
so
nice to see
you're
you
not just
again.
wandering around. Now you're actually settling in. So
I feel like this might actually be my spot for doing this. We're calling this room the library,
okay,
and currently we have some travel posters of Scotland and whatnot, but
nice.
I also have one of these travel posters of Hobbiton. Just
Right,
makes sense. Yeah.
right, right.
So
Plus your New
I won't show
Hampshire
you the
one
rest of the
right up
room.
there.
This is, yes, I'm like, yeah. I won't show
Yeah,
you the rest of the room. This is the only wall that looks finished and tidy.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, yeah. So we had intended to do several more episodes in August, and then we just went on this horrible run of Maggie and I never being able to match our schedules up
He
for
went on
weeks in a
vacation,
row.
then I went on vacation. I mean,
Yeah,
just life is tough, guys.
yeah. We thought almost about either doing an airport episode, another airport episode, or
Classic.
Maggie was like, I could do one the day I get back, and I was like, oh man, that's kind of
I did
hard.
offer. I was like, I'll
Yeah,
do it, but I am flying overnight with a toddler. So I can't
exactly. Right.
guarantee you what kind of Maggie you'll get.
Exactly. So it's all good. We are we are delighted to be back today. Kind of getting back into things today, and what we want to talk about today is a kind of an interesting angle on a a sort of a familiar but important topic, the question of canon. The both the sort of the definition of canon, the establishment of canon, and also even really kind of thinking about that on two sides. One issue of canon, of course, which always comes up right away when you're thinking about adaptation. Well, especially with something like Tolkien, it's a little. But no, even there, even with a kind of like an adaptation of like just one single book, right, rather than like a whole kind of series and a whole sort of thing like Tolkien's is, or like Harry Potter or something like that. There are still questions of canonicity, right? Like when you have a single book written by an author, but do you include things the author said, right, that
Hmm.
aren't in the book, right? Does that what counts as canon, right? So even with a simpler situation, textual situation, I mean, than Tolkien's situation, there are always questions of canon and trying to define um, a what is canon, but then b the question that I'm concerned is to what extent do we care, right? But so there's that question, which is to say a very familiar question when thinking about adaptation. But of course, there's also then the question about film canon itself. Like when we are kind of entering into the world of the film adaptation, we're redefining. It complicates the question of canon. Right now, do you have two separate canons? You've got book canon and movie canon, like that's often true, and you'll hear people using that vocabulary. I mean, many conversations I'll be talking about, like book Legolas versus film Legolas and that kind of thing, right? So there you can have the separate film canon, but then of course even defining that can get interesting and
Messy.
complicated, right? And of course the Lord of the Rings films are a classic example there too, where you have the cinematic release and you have the extended release, and then you have other things, right? Like uh Maggie, I know you were just recently watching a video of the old Cannes presentation reel, right?
Yeah, I'd never seen this before, and it's a 26-minute reel from 2001 Cannes Film Festival, and it's while they were still finishing the film, so it has different music over it, and it has lines that didn't make the final cut of the film. Nothing like revolutionary, but different. So
Different, right?
it just made me kind of go, huh, that's interesting. How does that affect what we consider canon? And, we've seen loads of deleted scenes, and we know that some things were filmed and not put in. We know that there's other content that they would have liked to put in that they didn't. So, where do we draw that line?
Right, yeah, and of course we have the then we have people who are wanting to complicate the canon even further, like our friend Don Marshall from TikTok, who's been agitating for, second extended edition, right? Knowing that there exists footage, that did I support it too.
If you haven't heard this, he's basically petitioning that there's all this other footage, and he's like officially petitioning that Peter Jackson said that he would release an extended cut 20 years from now if people still wanted it. So he's basically like, I still want it. And he's
you
really
still want it, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so then, what do we do with that? What do we, so anyway, there's my, my main thoughts. I mean, I sort of betrayed some of my thoughts about canon questions earlier when I was talking about, the extent to which we care. But I want to be careful. I don't want to sound too flippant about this, right? I mean, it's questions of canon matter. I think it's really, really easy for people to get hyperfixated on questions of canon, what become essentially questions of authority, right? Like, I'm going to define what are the, correct and acceptable parameters of the story, whether you're talking about the print text or whether you're talking about, the film text, or how that's defined, what is the real canon. You can hear, and of course it's not just a Tolkien issue. You hear people debating this with like Marvel, for instance, all the time, right? You've got the like comic book canon, people, which is, needless to say, the comic book canon is really complicated. And then, you've got the movies and TV shows, and some of which didn't really sync up, and like what counts and what gets included, and
even within like the DC universe, we've got the same movie with different cuts, with the Zack Snyder Justice League and the standard Justice League, and those are two very different films. So which one is canon? And canon, I don't feel the need for us to discuss like what's right, what's wrong, why does it matter flippantly. It's more like, isn't it interesting? Let's talk around why this is so much of a focus point, and why it ought to be a focus point and something to be considered carefully in adaptation, but not looking for the right or the wrong. It's just taking into consideration all the different stuff. It's when canon is used by fans as ammunition that it gets real messy, when they're like, no, I know this because da, da, da. Right. Hang on, there's a lot more there that we gotta talk through, and it's never as simple as we think it is. So defining canon, I think, is a big deal, but no definition of canon is going to be satisfactory for somebody to have a clear answer about what should be in a film.
Yeah. And I would add, by the way, often it's very, very useful if you're having a discussion or you're thinking about something, to kind of make sure, especially if you're having a discussion with multiple people, to kind of like define terms, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is what we're... So I mean, again, to use a Tolkien example, right? If somebody wants to say, I want to think about, like the Peter Jackson films and the Rings of Power and their relationships with Tolkien's text, but I want to restrict that to the question of like the published Lord of the Rings, or something like that. Okay, that's a parameter. It's like an acceptable parameter. You can have a discussion within those parameters. That's totally fine. It's, as you say, it's when things get to the point where you want to like weaponize this, right? Like, you can't say these things because I have like asserted, possibly even unstated, right, that I define this in this way. It's when you start getting dogmatic about like the only canonical Tolkien work is, the things that were published in his lifetime. Like that's hard. I don't accept that definition. And but again, you can establish ground rules for a discussion, and that makes the discussion interesting. But one of the other reasons why, again, not that I'm really meaning to be flippant, but one of the reasons why I don't get really invested in these questions of canon exactly is that to me, trying to establish like what is the definitive, story is just, I'm not very interested in that. I'm interested in...
To what end?
Yeah, exactly. I'm interested in... You can talk about the story at different levels. Like, it's really fascinating, for instance, to look at the cinematic release versus the extended release. This actually is something we could even, I think would be a fun topic for a future one, to really kind of go through in detail, look at the scene lists, right? And say, because what's interesting there is not that, again, it's not like a pejorative thing. Like, these are the second class scenes because they're only in the extended edition, or by contrast, there are many people who are like, the extended edition is the only real edition of those movies, and the cinematic releases are dead, right? So different people will take different stands of that kind. But again, the point is against any such stand, and instead ask interesting questions, right? It's fascinating to say, like, okay, so we know, right? We're being given a really interesting piece of information there, right? And that is, given what they had, like, just taking the extended edition for a moment as like, okay, this is the larger version, right, that they were drawing from, and from that they made these choices, right? We know, because it happened, right, that they chose to cut certain scenes and not cut other scenes. What does that tell us? What patterns can we see there? On what basis did they choose to cut? Or again, what conclusions can we draw about the basis on which they were cutting some scenes and not other scenes? How does the story of the film change through these cuts? And because it's a different story, right? They're not the same stories. They're not the same films. I think it's fascinating.
It is, and the folks that get so wrapped up in what is canon, well, that's not canon, I can't love this because it's not canon. It's kind of the same attitude I think we've always shared when we were going into Rings of Power and you with The Hobbit. Like, why would you limit yourself that early on? Let's just see what happens, and then we can start talking about the levels. Because if you just kind of say this is based off of what, and then you're limiting yourself to not being able to enjoy it. Whereas if you go enjoy it, and then you get to pick it apart and say, oh my God, that's where they pulled that from, and that's where they got that from. And with Rings of Power, that was one of the most exciting things that we saw from the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah.
Before, we didn't really have a canon. There isn't a scripted text for this. But the source material that they were pulling from was all that little stuff. All those little references and the letters and the notes and the margins and stuff that
and the later drafts and
you wouldn't necessarily consider that canon, but you'd have to respect that research because they're Tolkienists, so when does canon stop mattering to those people and step into the realm of respecting the research as a Tolkienist? Wait a second, I guess that is okay. Yeah, so why would you limit yourself? Don't be snotty about it. Let's just engage with what's on the screen and where they got their information. When they start making up stuff and it doesn't work, then I've got some questions. Why'd you make that choice? But
yeah, I mean, and that's always the more interesting question anyway. But anyway, so the other thing, and I'm thinking here of the so in my Mythgard Academy series, we've been going through the history of Middle Earth. So we've been talking through everything that Christopher Tolkien published about the developing drafts of primarily the Silmarillion material, though the history of the Lord of the Rings is sort of there in the middle. And as people who have attended those sessions with me know, one of my favorite things to talk about generally are passages when Christopher Tolkien gives us the text, the first draft text that he wrote, including the parts that he crossed out and what he changed them to. I love that. That's so cool. It's so cool because you can see here's where his mind was at first. Like, here's the first story that he wrote, or the first, and they're usually micro, they're like single paragraphs, right? Or speeches or something. Like, here's how he first envisioned that. And we can see directly where his mind went after that initial thing. And so those kinds of things provide a kind of a glimpse into, it doesn't tell you the secret truth about the story, but it tells you here's the trajectory of his thinking from his earlier drafts to his later drafts. You can see he's definitely pushing, say, Gandalf's character in this direction, especially when you can begin to see patterns there, right, of how he's changed it, whether it's in the depiction of a certain character. Just I mentioned Gandalf there. It's very clear when you look at the way that this happens from the first drafts of The Lord of the Rings to the later drafts. He tones Gandalf down a lot. early draft Gandalf is like 3 times as grumpy. Early. So, I mean, the famous example, and we just talked about this in Exploring the Lord of the Rings. I say just, it was like 3 months ago. The passage, in the snow on Carothras, when they're trapped in the snow and they're trying to escape. The passage in which, in the published text, Gandalf says, still pretty crankily, to Legolas, when Legolas says, if Gandalf could go before us with a bright flame, he might melt, a path through the snow for us. And Gandalf shoots back at him and says, if elves could fly, they might go and fetch the sun for us. In the first draft, Gandalf threatened to set fire to Legolas and use him to melt the snow. Like he was going to use Legolas as a torch. I mean, he shoots. He's much crankier.
That's a very different story.
It's very different. Like nobody threatens to immolate anybody in the final text, right? But and you can see that trend. Like Gandalf often. The words that he first put in Gandalf's cranky. Like he's really short-tempered, and often fires off and says really mean stuff. And in the revisions, you can see him systematically kind of toning down Gandalf, right? And so that's fascinating.
Yeah, like I can see how that would work. Like that character sounds really fascinating and engaging, and that would move the story along from A to B pretty, quickly.
Yes.
I would miss the Gandalf we got to know, but I kind of want to get to know that Gandalf too.
He's fun. He's fun.
So you could see, like, you could consider that canon because it was written down, changed, but I guess, there's an argument there. So if we did see Peter Jackson creating that Gandalf, like, grounded in canon.
Yeah, thanks. JJ just quoted it. The actual line was, "Even I need something to work on. I cannot burn snow, but I could turn Legolas into a flaming torch. If that will serve, he would burn bright while he lasted." That was Gandalf's actual words in the first draft of that scene. Anyway, so Phil is suggesting his new headcanon is that Gandalf is still thinking all those things. He just doesn't say them out loud in the published text. Anyway, but again, I just use that as one illustration, right? I find it's one of my favorite parts, as I say, of the history of Middle-earth, when we actually can see the directly parallel texts, or even the places where we know, like, this word he crossed out and replaced with, even if there's one thing, like he crosses out one adjective and replaces it with another adjective. Like even that, I'm like, ooh, what does that show us? Like, why didn't he like that one? What was the basis of that choice? What direction does he seem to be pushing the story in, replacing that one adjective with a different adjective? So, anytime we get that sort of thing, again, rather than worrying about, like, is it canon, is it official, or whatever, just to say, like, what do we learn? What do we learn about what Tolkien's thinking about the story, about where it came from, about the trajectory? And so I find the same thing can be applied, first, that same thing can be applied to the films themselves, right? When we're thinking about things like the choices that they made. Again, not even just the choices about the relationship with the text, but the choices about the film itself. That's why I think looking at the extended edition and comparing it with the cinematic edition is so much fun, because you're seeing something that's kind of parallel to what I was just describing in the text, right? You have it's not that the extended edition is not an uncut version. It's a very carefully cut and curated, longer version, right? But even if we imagine that they started with that and trimmed it down, which is not even true, right? I don't think that would be how it would work. Instead, we have to imagine the whole body of footage that they had, right? Yeah. And they took all of that footage and they made the one film out of it to begin with. And then they made the extended editions out of it. And then it opens up the question of what would what would Don Marshall's further, second extended edition look like, right? What kind of story would that be, and how would that impact it?
And that's the stuff that's so interesting, of just like, what was kept, what was changed, and these are all still acceptable movies. Like the theatrical release is still canon, the extended is still canon, and it is exactly as you said with the body of work. And that's what made me think about this sizzle reel, or whatever, presentation reel, that it wasn't anything different, but it would have been very different to see
Right.
those lines in there. Like there was one about Saruman trying to convince Gandalf to take the ring, and we should yield it. We should do this, and we know that's how he feels. But hearing him say it was quite a different. Hello, quite a different vibe.
Right. Right.
She also just got shaved, guys. How funny is this? She's got a skinny body and a giant fluffy head. She loves it. She's strutting around the place. Anyway, cat distraction.
Cat distraction. There we go.
But yeah, this whole body that we have, and you just picture like how many different ways they film things. And we've heard of actors trying 27 different ways to say a line, especially if you think comedy with Steve Carell and Will Ferrell and things like that. Like that's what we get. But adaptation, we do have a little bit of flexibility because we do have canon from the text, but we might also have notes. We might also have, whatever else it is. But then we have artist interpretations. Maybe there's an extra grunt in there, which can change the whole meaning. We might have a really high-pitched voice, which changes the tone of that character to be more comedic rather than serious. Like, there's a lot of things that can construe what we would think as canon because it's not how we think it. And that's the whole base of the problem with adaptation, isn't it? Because what I'm watching is different from what's in my head. So all these are just continued examples of like there's a lot of issues that we just gotta take into consideration. But I love this idea of the body of footage that they have, and then just cherry picking the bits that make a lovely story. And then that wasn't good enough, so let's add another 45 minutes and make it bigger.
Right. Yeah, and it is true that like to these questions, right? To the questions of like different versions of the text and different, the author's different ideas at different places, whether it's Tolkien's multiple drafts or whether it's, J.K. Rowling's texts versus things that she said, in interviews later on or whatever. So you've got all that stuff. And then you've got, again, this whole body of footage and the different ways that they shape it in different contexts and seeing an earlier kind of go at it, in the can reel. But then, in addition, of course, these questions are also relevant to how they interact with the text themselves as well, right? There is a kind of, all right, I want to be cautious and say I'm using this metaphorically, not literally, but there's a kind of continuum between. Lost you for a second there.
Yeah.
Okay,
my camera froze. Sorry.
There's a kind of continuum between the development of the text and the development of the film. Again, I don't mean literally a continuum as if the film is like just a continuation of, it is Tolkien's ideas and isn't a continuation of Tolkien's ideas, but sort of metaphorically in the sense of, just as Tolkien's own ideas were dynamic, right? He was thinking about these, and Rowling's, every author's, thoughts and ideas are dynamic. And responding to things. So too is the adaptation responding to things in the text and sort of coming at things. I want to come to the example that Edith Eldora was saying, because I think it's a fascinating one. And that is the initial, when Peter Jackson got pushback for wanting to include, there are those scenes in the Lord of the Rings films where Aragorn's kind of flirting with Eowyn, right?
The fish stew. We remember.
Yeah. There's the, and even before, like even in the in the hall before they leave on their journey and stuff, like there are moments, right? There are moments where he comes right up to the edge of Aragorn being actively encouraging to Eowyn there, and Edith was pointing out that when kind of receiving pushback about that, Peter Jackson said it's in the text, like it's he was justifying it in the text, and I think he's not wrong. Like I think that he's and you can see, the more you know about the textual history, the more sense that makes. Arwen was added to the text late. Tolkien's original concept was that Aragorn and Eowyn were going to get married, like that. That's why that line is there, which so in the text, right, when Eowyn comes into the room at the feast at the welcoming feast when they're there, and Eowyn comes into the room bearing the cup, right? There's this line which like jumps off the page, especially to a first-time reader, right? It says like, and thus for the first time in the full light of day did Aragorn behold Eowyn, daughter of Rohan, right? And like, you know, as a reader, you're like, okay, this is momentous. Like, I'm picking up what you're putting down, right? This is going to really matter. And of course, in the final published text, it seems kind of a false trail, right? Because I mean, yeah, the relationship is going to be kind of significant in a way, but not like it sounds like that seems misleading. I mean, he left that line in the text, right? When he wrote it originally, he wrote that because the plan was for them to get married. Like that was in fact what it sounds like it's building up to was what it was building up to. And then later, very last minute, I mean, Arwen, the reason Arwen isn't more in the story, in the written story, is that she was added at the 11th hour. It was in the final revisions that he decided, no, wait, I want to do the Beren and Luthien thing. And so he creates the character of Arwen, writes her back in to a few places and makes it work.
But you can see even with that example of how complicated this would be to explain what canon is and who you need to satisfy and why they're pissed off. Like, I can see why people are annoyed by XYZ, but you can see why it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Just from a filmic perspective, 100% see why they would lean into that storyline, because there's not a lot for Eowyn to do in the grand scheme of things. So if we want to develop a little character something, and we don't have a ton of time with Arwen and Aragorn, if we have competition, then that's a good way to kind of stretch out the strength of the Aragorn-Arwen relationship. If we see Eowyn as not threat, because she's not going to like steal the man, but it is, you know, an attraction in a different direction. If we see that, then that creates a whole other conflict line that if you're picturing it on a graph, like, oh, all of a sudden the Aragorn, Eowyn, Arwen triangle's kind of interesting, and we didn't have that before. So just in terms of tension and pacing, that's really handy in a film. And if we get character development, which we kind of need for Eowyn, because she doesn't have a ton until the very end, we have that. We care about her more throughout the whole thing. So, I mean, like, story-wise, that makes sense to me. It's just real handy. We have this nugget of canon that we can refer back to and be like, but see, it was.
Yeah, so, like, the reasons, the storytelling reasons, right, why Peter Jackson might want to dwell on that a little bit, that thread, right, kind of, or, like, bring that thread back out again, are different from the reasons that informed both Tolkien's initial thought and his change, right?
You can see why some people would be annoyed at that. You're taking that story and you're using it for your own purpose. Yep.
Yeah.
That's what storytelling is.
That's what storytelling is. Exactly. Exactly. But it's one quick thing I want to clarify. Phil was asking. Was saying he must have just squeaked it in under the barrier because Fellowship was published ahead of the rest of them. No, Tolkien wrote the whole thing as one story, so he didn't. The Fellowship of the Ring was published well after, like years after the entire story had been finished. So the phase I'm talking about is very late in the writing of the story, but that was several years before the publication of the first book. And the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers were, I think, published within 1 year of each other. The Return of the King took some time, not because he was finishing the story, but because of the appendices. That slowed the publication of that a good deal.
And just looking at Nameless Arcanum's question too, that adding the extra scenes would be more difficult because then you'd have to include additional context to new scenes to make sure they fit. Yes, that's definitely true, and that's why you often hear about films going back to film pickups. So they'll have it in their contract to go back to New Zealand for 2 weeks to basically film these 4-second fillers to get them from A to B to make sure that transition works. But that's also how they take scenes out sometimes. So if they start to put things together and there isn't that smooth, then it's easier to take that scene out if it doesn't actually serve the purpose of the story. So
is that normally what pickups are?
Generally, sometimes it's like transitions and fill-ins, or the sound was really bad on that one and we need to fix it, or, you know, that costume piece, like Elijah Wood was wearing the wrong vest how many times in the Grey Haven scene.
Wasn't it Sean Astin who did the.
Oh, I thought it was
I think
Elijah. Was it Sean?
it might have been. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, one of
Yeah,
them.
I mean, whatever it is, it's something they
Yeah.
picked up that they might not actually fix something like a costume. They wouldn't necessarily prioritize that in a pickup, but if they're already there, they might as well do it, kind of a thing. But it's awfully expensive to just do that Greyhaven scene for a vest if you don't need to. But that actually wasn't a pickup. That they reshot that on the day. That just ended up being a really long day. But
Right.
pickups are usually like coming back because the audio was messed up somewhere, or we need an extra transition, or we need 6 seconds to see Aragorn run up those steps. So it makes sense that he got from the stables to the hall of Rohan, or whatever it happens to be. That's why if you watch Golden Compass, the Chris White's version from 2007, super choppy because they had to cut like 40 minutes of the finished film out of it because the Catholic Church got real pissed off about it. Excuse me, so they had this massive edit at the end. But if you go back and watch that, it feels so choppy because they did film some pickups after doing this massive cut, but they didn't have enough time or prep, anything to film everything they needed to make that smooth. So all those transitions are super, so that's a real tough one to like smush stuff back into.
Yeah. Sorry, I was laughing in the middle because on the one hand, like, that is obviously a major challenge to confront in your storytelling when you've planned and done your story and then are forced to take out 40 minutes of it. Like that's kind of hard. At the same time, I can't help but want to say, like, you didn't anticipate that a little bit, but like, did you read the book before you didn't even guess that there might be some pushback from the church?
That was one of my like major annoyances though. Like, you knew what you were signing up for and you panicked 6 weeks before theatrical release. Like,
exactly. That seems hard to defend.
Stick to your guns that you knew what you were signing up for.
Either stick to your guns or plan ahead a lot better. I mean,
Don't be so like, I don't think they were expecting the reaction to be quite as big as it was. I mean, the Catholic Church was calling for like a full-on boycott to this Christmas film that cost them $180 million.
Right.
But they still cut a stupid amount of that movie.
Yeah.
But you have to know what you're signing up for surely at the beginning. And there's a reason that 2 years go into these scripts. Like, you put the thought into it.
Mm-hmm.
Commit to that. And my 2 cents.
No, I mean, it's hard. So yes, that's complicated, but anyway, I do think that this, so thinking about, again, canon and versions and what those things kind of tell us on either kind of end or either side of the adaptation situation, but then to me, it really kind of comes back to and helps to inform, or not inform, recontextualize really the frontier between them, like the way in which the film story interacts with the book story on the other side,
which is a fun relationship, and I fully support the loving the book and loving the film, and they're allowed to be 2 very different things. Like, a friend recently just told me that her daughter's going to be Hermione for Halloween, and not Hermione, Ginny. And I said, is it book Ginny or is it film Ginny? Like, dead serious, because those are 2 very different characters in my head.
Right.
So these are important questions, but both of them are valid. It's just, where's your source material?
Yeah.
I think what's also fun to play with canon and adaptation and all of this is how other content worms its way in, like how we find out about other content and where the role of like DVD special features fit in to explain some of this. And Corey and I have talked about this a lot because we so miss DVD special features because it explained so many things. Even for like a cheesy rom-com, I so enjoyed the making of because you would hear the process of the story and how the story came to screen. And that process can be so informative, especially in an adaptation. Why did you change those things? Why did you think this was important? Who were you trying to please? All that kind of stuff. So getting that explanation, and that's where you find out, well, we did our research in the first draft of this, that happened. And that was also one of my annoyances with Rings of Power, that they didn't release a lot of that conversation that we learned about in our conversations with the showrunners. Like, that stuff's gold. Like, you got to tell the fandom that stuff. They're making it okay for us to like all the changes because they're giving us permission based on research that Tolkien's like.
Right. There's a lot that they're thinking about and there's a lot for viewers to think about. No, my favorite part of bonus features and stuff is just the invitation that they give and the material that they give, the raw material that they give for thinking through and thinking about things, right? One of my own kind of it's a little bit of a pet peeve is when people appeal to things that artists, whether it's authors or filmmakers or whatever, like they'll say something about, this was my intention or this is what I was trying to do or something. My pet peeve is when people hear those things and then basically are like, so that's law.
That's
right. That's what it is. Like they said, this is what they meant. And so that's what the thing is. And I'm always like, well, no, that's what they wanted to do. That's what they were attempting to accomplish. Whether or not they did in fact do that is an entirely different question. So like, by all means, let's, and again, of course, especially in the early years, J.K. Rowling was famous for these kind of declarations where she would, assert something authoritative about the text, which then if I challenged, people would yell at me. This used to happen in the early days. I remember like 10 years ago in the early days of Signum, getting into, people arguing with me and saying like, no, you can't say that about the books because she said that wasn't true. I'm like, I know she said it wasn't true. I think she's wrong. Like if you look at the text, like the text does not back up what she said. So
I can't remember if it was here or if it was elsewhere that we were talking about this, but yeah, it's J.K. Rowling is the best writer of her own fan fiction.
Yes.
She
Yes.
creates her own storylines to fill in the blanks of her own past working to suit her own situation where she is.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, and that's, fun. That's interesting. Right. But, I love that. So, but again, so it's not, the existence of that stuff is fun, and going back and it gives you some really interesting angles to look at even to understand, the development of thought. No author's minds are static, right? So, in some ways, I find it even more fun when the thing that an author says later on is different from what you can clearly find in the text, right? Because it shows you here's the direction in which their thought is working. I can give a Tolkien example of this. A Tolkien example of this is the essay on the essays on the Astari and the Palantiri in Unfinished Tales. So let's go with the Palantir. So he wrote this whole essay about how the Palantiri work, right? So if you have one of the Seeing Stones, how does it work? And he talked about what it can and can't do, and how you've got to position yourself from a certain angle in order to see things, and what you can see and what you can't see. And although none of those things are technically, he was very good at making sure that there was no technical contradiction to anything that was said in the text. It's pretty clear in my mind that, when I read the text and how the Palantiri are handled and treated and what people see and don't see and how they look at them and stuff, that it doesn't really fit what he describes later on. It's not, he's describing something which is just, it's not really he's elaborated it in a particular direction, right? Mm-hmm. And honestly, I don't love the direction that he went with it, right? I kind of prefer the way that the Palantir, they're much more mysterious. They're much more magical, right? They're much less mechanical. It's all about you look into the ball and it is like you're exerting your will and all these other things. Whereas, you could say, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but you could say, based on what he says in the essay on the Palantiri, that all Pippin had to do in order to avoid, gazing into the eye of Sauron, was if he had just sat 90 degrees around the other side, he'd have been fine.
Or turned his head. Yeah.
Right. He just, seriously, if he was holding the ball and just went like this, he's fine. No Sauron in that direction. Right. And it's like, no, that's not great. That's not as interesting a story, right? But
think of that on screen too. That doesn't work as well.
No, yeah. It doesn't. But see, here's the thing. Here's what is interesting about it. Again, I don't love the essay on the Palantiri. The story of the Palantiri that we're getting there is less interesting to me than the story I think that we get in the Lord of the Rings. But what is interesting is that it shows us some really fascinating things about the direction Tolkien's mind was going at that time, right? In the 1960s, when he was writing that stuff, what was the kind of stuff he was thinking about? And what we can see, especially when we combine that with other things that he was writing during that time in the 1960s, we can see one of the primary trends is that he's doing systematic world building, right? How do things work and how do they fit together, and how can I define those things and make sure there are no inconsistencies? He loved that, and he increasingly loved that over the course of his life. He kind of really got into that. This is why, of course, in the nature of Middle-earth, we end up with mathematical tables, right? Tolkien doing all these mathematical tables about elf growth and reproduction rates, because he was working it out, right? He wanted the system. He wanted to figure it. Anyway, so that's interesting. That's good to know. And similarly, I think that we can see some patterns too in the kinds of things that J.K. Rowling was saying later on compared to what she wrote in the original books. How she wants to see the diary of Tom Riddle in retrospect, right, from her later perspective, compared to what we get about the Riddle diary, in the Chamber of Secrets. So anyway, there's a lot of things that we and that's fascinating. That's really cool. But again, it's cooler if you're able to be a little bit flexible with it and you're willing to kind of see that. And of course, the corollary to that is when you're doing an adaptation, all this stuff is fair game.
Yeah, all of this is on your table. And there's so many different levels, as we keep saying, but I feel like what you referenced is so important, and that's about your own relationship to the text and how flexible you're willing to be when engaging in an adaptation. But I think there's also this element of the creator and our relationship with the creator, because so much of it comes from a place of defense, like, why are you taking my favorite book and like, you don't get to do this, I know more than you know. Right. So the loss of special features drops the ability to have that relationship. I think, like, the majority of why, there's so many reasons why we love the Peter Jackson trilogy, and there's a lot of reasons people are not happy with it, but the reason I think that it was so successful is because he lifted that curtain so thoroughly and allowed us to become not friends with him. He wasn't looking to be a buddy. He was looking to show us how much he cared about this and the detail and the work he put into it. It was almost like he was reassuring everybody at every step of the way, but he never came off like he was reassuring. It was just, look at how much stuff I love, and that enthusiasm, it's identifying as a fan. So if you can identify with a fan, as a fan, like a fan, show your research, then you're allowing that relationship to happen. The loss of DVD features, now we only have corporate polished interviews on late night TV, and that's
or
just not the
marketing
same.
Snippets on YouTube channels.
Yeah, or really structured 10-minute interviews on Twitter or whatever it happens to be. It's not the same kind of dynamic we get as hours of content. Like, you're saying my favorite part of, well, I have two favorite parts of bonus, well, three favorite parts. Gag reels were great. I miss gag reels. I loved the making of stuff because that showed the detail, and this whole race comes from this region, so therefore everything's going to be really rocky and earthy and leather. Great, show me that. Commentaries. Oh, do I miss commentaries? Like the Peter Jackson trilogy, I feel like I learned more about filmmaking. I mean, it was fun to listen to the actors' commentary because they were just really fun, but listening to Peter Jackson and Philippa go through the trilogy and just sit like we were sitting next to them, I think I learned more about filmmaking doing that than I did in my PhD.
Right.
Yeah, that insight was so good, and it allowed us to love it. It gave us permission to be like, oh, these guys do know their stuff. great.
Yeah, I do think, again, one of the effect of having less of that kind of material available to us in the streaming era than we did in the DVD era is I think it also creates a kind of, well, I want to say a false impression of kind of take it or leave it about the story, right? Like, if you don't pull back that curtain, if you don't get any glimpse into, here is the work that we were doing and unfolding our story, here's the story that we were trying to tell and some of the ways in which we were trying to do it, here are some of the things that I think about the source story and how we wanted to relate. I mean, if you don't get any of that, then what you get is just this kind of monolithic, here's our final, here is our version of whatever the original source material was, right? Kind of like take it or leave it. It can feel almost like aggressive, right? Like we've redone it in this way and this is better or whatever, or sometimes people will, I mean, it sounds to me anyway, that some people will assume a kind of almost oppositional stance, right? Like they're, I don't know what, claiming it or trying to take it over or something like that. Where again, you can hear much more, in a much more nuanced fashion, I think. You are prompted to think more in terms of seeing this as a product of a sort of a dynamic and creative interaction with the original. They are telling their own story. They are doing their own thing. But
they're kind of inviting us along on the process as opposed to challenging it.
Yeah, and I think that it kind of creates an obstacle. Like, for instance, people who feel, and again, this is a conclusion I'm drawing from hearing how people talk about these things, like they have to choose, right? Like, which seems also to me, well, it's not exactly the same issue when people talk about an adaptation ruining the original for them. Again, it's that same kind of, like,
Why?
Why
would you let that happen?
I've never understood it. I can't. I've tried and tried to imagine myself into the position of, like, but I can't think of a single like source, like, book that I've loved that a bad adaptation has actually ruined for me.
No,
I'm just
again, I mean, do I need to bring up The Dark is Rising yet again? Like, I mean, if we want to talk about adaptations, but that has no reference to the book for me at all. It's so far gone. Why would I attach the two? No thanks.
Yeah. I mean, there have been times when I've seen an adaptation that was really bad, and I'll say something like, okay, I'm going to go back and reread the book to kind of cleanse myself, right? To kind of refresh my my mind and kind of clear my imaginative palette of that very unpleasant and very, very poor adaptation. But that's that, to me, that's the most of it. Like, and I can't even imagine going back to the book afterwards and finding that I now love the book less because I didn't like that movie or whatever. It's hard. I wish I understood that better. I do. If anyone who is watching has that experience and can say anything to help me understand it, I mean, I can see how visual images could creep in, right? Like, I mean, one thing that I can imagine is having your own, like, you picture the characters in your head, and after you see the movie, now you're picturing those actors and it, your own imaginative landscape from your own, your own internal adaptation has been replaced by that visual imagery that you took in, that now you can't unsee it, right? So now, now Boromir looks like Sean Bean and there's nothing you can do about it, right? He will always look like Sean Bean in your head from now on. I can see how that can sort of change things, and I can see why that, to me, honestly, is a perfectly acceptable reason to not watch them. Like, if you're worried about that, if that happens to you and you're worried about that, don't don't watch. It's
Yeah.
I don't make that choice myself generally, but I could respect somebody who said, you know what, I don't want my own imagine, this is my comfort food. I love going to this imagined world that I have in my head when I read this, and I don't want that sort of trespassed on by these other intrusive, alien to me, to my mind, visual images. I could respect that, I think.
And
But yeah.
and I definitely get the, like, if you go re-engage with, again, if you go and re-engage with your book again, like, I love it so much more, because it's like, oh my god, this is what I signed up for. Like, it's like going back to an old friend. You get all those details, and it's like, oh yeah, this is the good stuff. But I understand the grimace, the cringe of, like, I am going back to read this book because it's perfect and it's wonderful, but oh god, I forgot about that. That makes me feel sick. And yeah, sure, but it's not going to ruin my book. My book's still perfect, but I will cringe on its behalf that they made Will Stanton a 14-year-old American with a twin trapped in an alternate dimension. I will cringe at that because it reminds me of that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, I can kind of see that. Like, kind of like a song reminds you of an ex. Exactly. Like, yeah, reading my favorite book does remind me that terrible film exists. Ugh. But I'm not going to watch that film again. I'm going to read my book again.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I don't know, in my experience, even that kind of thing, or rather, I guess I would say, anything that I have moved past because of a negative association like that, I don't think was ever something that meant that much to me in the first place, right?
Yeah, and you kind of file it away until potentially the next thing. Like, I hated the Seeker film, but it was funny, and now I talk about it in classes and stuff all the time as a great example. But then we got the BBC adaptation that just came out last Christmas, and that was glorious. That was absolutely beautiful. So, peaks and troughs. And there's some real sketchy adaptations of The Lord of the Rings that kind of only add to the fun of the discussion. But that doesn't mean you have to take them as the be-all, end-all. You get to choose what you engage with. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Phil, don't worry, I'll save you the trouble. Just skip it. He said it. Glad every time that he never managed to see it.
Yeah, I didn't see it either.
I feel like sometime I want to do a screening, and it would have to be like drunk history. Like, I'll just drink through it.
Yeah. we'd have to have like check-ins with you at some point around. But no, I still think, I mean, we've been threatening to do this for a while. I still think it would be Now, I'm not that I'm going to make you do this one in this way, right? I'm not going to force you there. But to talk about bad adaptations, right? To talk about what makes bad adaptation.
What makes a bad adaptation? And that's, I mean, I feel like we can answer that pretty quickly and then talk about it at length in a different episode. But like, what makes a bad adaptation is a bad story. Full stop. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if it's different than the text. If it's a bad story, it's a bad film, and therefore it's a bad adaptation. So like, it all just has to come down to story. If your story is good,
and that can be true in. There are many examples of bad films that adhere quite closely to the original story, but are bad adaptations because it's bad storytelling and it's not interesting at all.
They didn't tell it well, and the characters didn't translate the way that they did on the page, because you need to. Sorry, my camera keeps freezing for some reason, but hopefully you can still hear me. But the story side of stuff is not just the actor says the words that the character said on the page. That doesn't work. You have to look at a page of text and say, what's the purpose of this page? What are the words that are being said? Does that show growth of the character? Does that show conflict, love, challenge, anger, hate? If the purpose of that page of text, now I'm making a real good face. If the purpose of that page of text is to get pissed and break up with your boyfriend and then move on to the next thing, then that's what we need to see. Not the step-by-step breakdown of those words, but the actual, like, anger, irate, betrayal, disappointment, moving on. There's a lot of different ways you can show that. It does not have to be word for word what we saw in the text.
Absolutely. No, I think that would be great fun. But no, all of this, I mean, you know, thinking about the you know, the place where we started talking about canon, which, and I mean, I think I guess the going back and kind of trying to sort of wrap that up a little bit. The point there is not just about how it's unhelpful to kind of try to rigidly define and particularly weaponize your own personal definitions of canon. That's, of course, part of the issue. But to really draw attention to the fluid nature of almost every text itself. And of course, this is even true because here's another element of that. We've talked at several points about like the book that's in your mind, right? That changes also. The book doesn't change, but you change, and your reading of it changes. I mean, I've often said, you know, every time I reread The Lord of the Rings, it's a different book. Like I notice new things about it. I see. So even when talking about things like, you know, what are the major themes of The Lord of the Rings? You know, I don't think I would answer that question the same way right now as I would have done 25 years ago. You know,
sure.
The book hasn't changed, right? But my own,
in a different way,
right? What is changing? What is a dynamic thing? Is the book in my head, right? Not my own interpretation of it in the sense of like now I'm pushing it in a different way, right? It's not something I'm doing to the. It's there's a very fluid and interactive frontier between the book and the reader. Right. The thing that you're actually it's never the words on the page that you're actually kind of dealing with. Right. It is that thing that emerges in your imagination. How many times have all of us had the experience where you go back and reread something again and you're like, okay, that thing that's been in my head, it's actually not there. Like I misremembered it, or like you build it up in certain ways and you're like, actually, that didn't happen in the text, or contrariwise, like we often in exploring the Lord of the Rings, it's one of the rewards of doing a sentence by sentence discussion of it as we've been doing there. There'll be paragraphs we'll read and I or somebody else will be like, has this paragraph always been there? Like it's like you know, it's like when you read it, this is the paragraph that I always kind of, where my mind kind of checks out for a minute. I've never really processed it.
Deep breath moment.
Yeah. And I'm like, is this sentence, I don't think I've ever actually understood this sentence or what it is referring to. I mean, that happens all the time. And so again, like it's the book, it's even when you don't, not thinking in terms of like the author changing his or her mind over time and you know, later revisions or anything. I mean, those things of course exist and complicate the canon question, but really the crucial and important thing is that what the book is, what the story is, it's always about how we interact with it. And that's why when you reread a book that you love, it's a similar experience, right? But it's never exactly the same experience twice. It's not just like, I want to go on the roller coaster a second time, right? It's new, it's different. Of course, even the roller coaster the second time isn't exactly the same as the first time, but nevertheless, and so again, this is why the more you think about this stuff, the more you come to think about not only storytelling, but story reading, right? And story reception, and how those two things work together, and how fascinatingly fluid these frontiers are. This is why I find adaptation so much fun to think about, because really, like, that is in a sense, what we're getting, or almost what we're getting, what the movie maker hopes we're getting is somebody else capturing like their version, right? Like this is what they see, this is what they feel. So even when people are like these are the most important themes in Tolkien, and they didn't hit on those themes, so it's not really true to Tolkien. On the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to those arguments, and goodness knows there are themes I would thump the pulpit for, when it comes to saying, like, this is really, you're really getting Tolkien and what matters in his world, and you're not getting. I mean, this is one of the primary things that I dislike about the adaptation, the video game adaptation, the Shadows of Mordor and Shadows of War games. So I mean, I totally get that. I absolutely respect it. But, like, footnote, at the same time, that they see something different from me is interesting. And, we can kind of get outside our own, it helps us to get outside our own heads. Looking at adaptations draws our attention to this stuff more, and thinking about these frontiers and how all of this is really fluid and interesting.
And thinking about the different ways to kind of interpret it as well. I mean, we're talking about the same film at various points in our own lives, or the same book at various points in our own lives, or sometimes the directors go back and reshoot things because the technology's better, so it's the same story but with better getting that out there. But then there's also this whole other, like, but it's the purpose of the creator again too. So when we're thinking back, like, our Christmas Carol discussion, where we did 5 different versions of A Christmas Carol, each of those had a different audience, a different purpose, a different, clearly the Will Ferrell Christmas Carol is going to be a lot different than Mickey Mouse's Christmas Carol than 1927 or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah, there were so many different ways to interpret that. It's the same story. But the director, the creator, the writer wanted that to be told in very different ways for us to receive it in very different ways. So there's so many different ways we can play with adaptation. And that's what's so exciting too. So depending on how we take that story, and I think you just brought up a good one too, taking it to a different platform.
Yes.
Rings of Power on a streaming service is so different than a feature film in the theater, 3 film, 90-minute, 2-hour, whatever, 3-hour with their extended cut. Taking it to a game, taking it to an interactive game, taking it to, so many different ways that you can take that you can play with story.
Yeah. So now thinking about this is, and it's interesting because, of course, like, stepping back for a second into our other profession, right? What we're talking about is critical theory, right? We're talking about things that English professors talk about what is a text and what it means to read a text, and what's going on when readers are receiving texts and that sort of thing. And a lot of people don't find that kind of thing very interesting, or at least my reaction has tended to be that people, I find that students are often put off by that because of the distance it seems that it's like, instead of reading stories or talking about stories, let's analyze the process of reading in a very sort of dry and abstract and philosophical way. And it's anyway, I'd say it's usually not a way to thrill a crowd, but the adaptation situation really brings these things to the fore in some really, I just think some really visceral and clear ways.
And I think it's a really good conduit to look at some of these things that otherwise are really difficult to kind of understand, because critical theory is not my favorite thing either. And it's nice to have a way to talk about it with something that you know really well and like a lot, and be like, oh, I get it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and this is part of the big reason why I am so fascinated by adaptation. Like, we're doing this series. I'm participating in this series. I'm not participating primarily because, like, now I want to focus on movies, right? I'm interested in movies. I want to focus on movies. I mean, I am kind of interested in this, but what fascinates me about the process, what I find so rewarding, and this is another thing that I feel like I've rarely been able to communicate successfully to people. I get really annoyed when people tell me, like, you shouldn't even watch that because it's bad,
right? Like, it's okay. I mean,
You mean like I just told Phil? Just
well,
don't skip it.
you know, it's
All right, let me rephrase, Phil. You can watch it because then you're knowledgeably dissing
yeah.
it with.
Oh man, yeah, exactly. But
But actually,
not,
that's a really like I scream at people all the time when they don't read Harry Potter, but then say it's just a kid's book, so they don't want to read it.
right.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah,
well, at
yeah.
least watch it so you can knowledgeably disengage with it.
Yeah, well, but more than that, like, I love talking about adaptations, good or bad. Like, that's not that.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why it doesn't matter to me. I mean, Maggie, you and I've had this conversation many times throughout the whole Rings of Power season 1 experience, and we kept the question everybody comes back and asks immediately, right? Like, you know, how did you like it? How did you like it? Is it good?
Yeah.
How did you like it? Do you think it's good? And I'm like, I don't care. That is not my question.
No.
I'm not interested in that question. I'm not even interested in the question of do I like it? That's not, for me, that's not my primary question. The question is like, what's happening? Let's think about it, right? And I love it, not because I love the shows, not because I love the movies, but because it's like in themselves, like many of them I do love and I am really interested in, but because I have learned so much more about the books, studying, thinking about Tolkien adaptations, good or bad, that I've done over the last 10 years has helped me to understand Tolkien so much better. I think about the books so much more and so much more clearly after doing that. That's to me the precious thing. So like, do I have an opportunity? And again, this is also why I also don't have any sympathy of any kind with people who say things like, oh yeah, all this like new Star Wars material that Disney's pumping out, like whatever, it's all lame and I'm not, and I'm like, look,
Like you're missing out.
this is, I mean, I'm not even going to argue that it's all excellent. It's not all excellent. There's been high variations even within particular shows that they've released of things that are good or moments that are good. I mean, even in like, I think probably as far as I can I still haven't seen Ahsoka. Heck, I haven't even seen season 3 of The Mandalorian yet. I'm way behind. I did finally see Andor, but that's like anyway. But my understanding, but from what I've heard, and again, I don't spend all my time in this community, but I think many people would agree that the Book of Boba Fett was probably the least good of all of the recent series that have come out. That's the one I hear people complain about the most. And when I watch them, I think it's least successful of all of them. But even that one has really interesting elements to it that I like very much. Anyway.
And fun when you're thinking about adaptation because they're taking this like tiny character that became a cult favorite and just created this world around him. Like that's fun, things that exist in the world. And like we were saying in that whole May the 5th episode of, what is it that makes a Star Wars show, film, short, whatever, a Star Wars thing. That's fun to think about. Like, what are the things that make us exist in this world? And that's part of an adaptation too. And I do like it when I like things better. So like, yeah, I will fall into that camp of being like, well, I hated that. Don't watch that. But like, that's okay. I don't know. I got my moments.
It's perfectly fine to warn people
have the opinion.
Who are like how to help them triage their priorities, right? Like, don't get your hopes up that this is something big that you're missing, right? It's
That's such a good way to phrase it though, to triage your expectations. Somebody earlier said in the chat on Twitch something that I say all the time to my students of just like, you need to leave your pitchforks at home because they're not going to have warned you about everything they've changed. They will have told you about a few things because they want their audience to be prepared. Like, oh yeah, we said, Harry's eyes were going to be green, but actually they're blue. Chill, it's going to be fine, But there's always things that are different that they're not prepared for, but that's the stuff that takes you out of the film. So if you can accept that they won't have told me everything going into it, you might not get as mad. But,
Yeah, exactly. But again, like the people who say like, oh, I just wish Disney would stop producing new Star Wars material, and I'm like, I don't. Like there's really, it's and the Marvel stuff. Like I'm ready. Like I'm ready.
I wish I had more time though. I'm so behind. But
it's trying to keep up is a challenge.
And like it is a challenge for a fun reason, because there's a lot of good stuff, but I genuinely do miss there being less stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to stop more from coming for all the things we're saying.
Right.
But remember when we just waited for the next Marvel film, and I literally waited, like I would show up at midnight because I had waited months for this.
Right. Right.
I loved that. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
do miss that because there's so much.
There is a lot. And this is why, like, I'm, I've heard people express, there's a fairly broad sentiment, and we've talked about it before, that there's a great deal of Tolkien stuff coming, that in the next 10 years we can expect
We got a lot
something
to
which, compared to the last 10 years, will look like floodgates opening and a deluge of Tolkien material, whether it be in video game, in streaming television, in feature films. Both live action and animated, and all kinds of different things. There's going to be, I think that is almost certainly true. There's going to be lots of stuff that's going to come, and I've heard people express dread about that, like, or trepidation, right? I'm ready. I'm ready because I bring it. Absolutely bring it. Because again, the more there is to think about, the more there is to. Again, I haven't gotten to it yet, the Ahsoka series, but I'm looking forward to it because I just finished watching Clone Wars relatively recently, in the last 6 months, and Ahsoka was my favorite character from Clone Wars. I thought she was a fascinating character through the whole show, and so I'm not, because I'm expecting I'm going to get the same thing. It's different people. It's a different format. There's all kinds of things that are different about it, and yet I'm going to be really interested to compare and contrast, right? And the way in which we get, like, the kind of the triple interaction between the new Ahsoka series, the Clone Wars, which is where Ahsoka's character began, was developed, and the original Star Wars series, right? The kind of triangulation between these
and
things.
Mandalorian, she's there too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So cool. Such a rich, like, intertextual situation, and I can't wait to sort of see how that comes. And I did watch Rebels, Druid's Fire, so I'm good there.
And that's what's so fun with all the, transmedia storytelling, is the phrase that's often attached to this when you're telling the story across different platforms. And that is what's so fun about this. When you do get a mention from that cartoon that's then played up in that game, which actually comes from that comic, like, that's fun. And I feel like it's all like choose your gateway drug, right? Like, it's just which is your point of entry to this thing. And then if you want to engage with more, you have so much more that you can engage with. If you want to stick with just your graphic novel, you're going to be so happy, Right. But it's going to be awfully fun for the next couple of years. Like, of course I have some trepidation, because I think have more of an evaluator reaction than you do, where I'm just like, I hate that. That's fine. I've accepted that. I'll still talk about it, but yeah. So, like, I do have some trepidation about some of it, especially because so much is coming out. I think the trepidation I have is, like, not the politics, but, like, the egos that might get involved. I feel like there's going to be, like, when Rings of Power came out and the House of Dragons was out at the same time, this is all marketing and publicity. All the marketing and publicity was just a competition, like, who's going to win or who's better, rah, rah, rah. I don't want any of that. I just want to look at the content. So if we can avoid the marketing mess and the drama and the soap opera that they blow up, and we just get to engage with the content and maybe the fandoms, because I love that part, and the creators. But
Right. Well, and that's one of the things, again, coming back to that stuff that this is the kind of thing that we're excited to be doing at Signum Studios, is getting into this, inviting this kind of discussion, inviting and facilitating this kind of engagement with stuff, beyond just the, I loved it and it sold really, try to make as many people watch it as possible within the first, couple weeks, and then, judge it and its success based only on that, rather than really kind of taking time to think through it and work through it.
Yeah, give me the hours that Peter Jackson gave me. Like
Right.
if we get to even make a tiny bit of that kind of content to explain, to help other people understand, to come to some conclusions, to see things in a different light, that's brilliant. And bringing in other creators and things like that is definitely a cool way to do that. So
Yeah.
let's hope so, folks.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
know, I miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time here. I know we're not going to be able to meet next week because you're going to be busy next week. So,
Yeah, my daughter's having surgery, so everybody send all the good vibes. She'll be
yeah,
fine. It's routine, but it's not going to be fun. So
right.
send all the good
Yeah,
vibes.
that never is. So,
Nope.
um,
And the following Thursday, I'm hoping to be, we'll be home, and I think I could use a little normalcy. So let's hope the following Thursday is fine. But
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So in one or possibly two, hopefully 1 week after, that is to say.
yeah, not next
1
week.
Not
after.
next week. The next week. We'll be back. So it'll be the first Thursday in October, I think.
Correct.
Is what that means. So yeah, first weekend in October, we will be we'll be hoping to be back, and we will see. We will see what there's a bunch of things to talk about. We've discussed talking about the Barbie film, which I did get to see in August. I think that would be interesting. That was I find that such a fascinating adaptation concept.
Well, and you blew my mind with, I don't know if you want to say it here, what you compared it to, because
oh my goodness,
did not cross my
I'm
mind.
almost ready to treat 2001: A Space Odyssey as a source text of the Barbie film. I mean,
and now
like
that he said it, and I'm like, I see it.
it's I mean,
I did not.
I was blown away by that. So that was one of the things that I'm like, okay, I did not see that coming, right? I did not see that particular. Anyway, so there's all kinds of fun stuff going on there, and there'll be more Tolkien.
Autoflagellator says some Lovecraft adaptations might be interesting. Well, I happen to be teaching a class on that right now, so the
right.
end of the semester,
That is...
we're putting some new lectures into the Signum University Lovecraft course. There's 5 new lectures, so we've done 2, and there's going to be 3 more at the end of term. And the 3 at the end are about the new adaptations, because there's been so many that have come out since 2015 when that course was first written. That it's going to be a heck of a lot of fun. So we're doing Lovecraft Country, we're doing the BBC radio drama, we're doing a whole slew, Color Out of Space, a whole slew of stuff.
You know what?
So, yeah.
Just to randomly segue onto that topic for a few minutes. You know what fascinates me about Lovecraft as both a cultural phenomenon and an adaptation question? Lovecraft seems to have worked its way into the consciousness of our society, despite the fact that there have not been really famous adaptations made of it. Like there's not been like a big Lovecraft movie that has there's no parallel to the Lord of the Rings films, right? Where like now Tolkien is in the modern consciousness, and thanks to the Peter Jackson films in ways that it wasn't before. There's been no parallel with Lovecraft there, and yet everybody knows the name Cthulhu, right? People use words like eldritch, right? I mean, there's so many Lovecraftian things. Like Lovecraft has kind of like wormed his way into the culture, and yet
I feel like that's more of his thing. Like, here's my hand in the air. I honestly didn't read Lovecraft until I taught the course a few years ago. Like, it was not my thing. I didn't engage with it. Once you engage with it, you're like, oh my god, now I get it, because it's everywhere. I think Lovecraft was just the one that wormed his way in. So he was the foundation upon which everything was built. So he gets all the credit, I think. Like, Lovecraftian is now a term that we're really familiar with.
Yes.
But it's not actually what he did. It's what he inspired. Like, I think what he created is so influential in what came after it, that it's the Neil Gaimans, it's the other ones that built off of that you're like, oh, because it's not sci-fi fantasy, it's this weird, creepy sci-fi element that's cosmic.
And that's the thing. Like, I think that like not only has there not been like a major famous Lovecraft adaptation, people don't even read much Lovecraft. Like, it's like, how did Lovecraft become so famous with people with no famous adaptations and people not even reading the books, right? But I agree. I think that progress, like over time, it's not that we read Lovecraft, we read things that are influenced by Lovecraft. I totally think that Druid's Fire is correct. Dungeons and Dragons is one of those things. Like a lot of Lovecraftian elements were worked into, especially the early editions of D&D. Not just particular things like mind flayers and such, but a good deal of the sort of larger ethos or questions. Anyway, but yeah, I think so.
Gabriel's going to talk about that too. He's going to talk about a bunch of the games that have been, brought into play recently with that. And Meow, indeed, I think you're right. Hollywood took the Lovecraft and just ran with the concepts because the concepts were so universal, but so clearly defined by Lovecraft.
Yes.
Also, because if you go back and read Lovecraft, it doesn't hold up well, which was my whole second lecture. He's a real problematic author.
He is a problematic author.
There's a lot of problems in his writing. So we don't actually use much of his writing, but his concepts are timeless and universal. So it's taking...
Yeah, the concepts are much more timeless than the stories. The stories are very not timeless. Yeah,
they're not so good.
They're very dated. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, but yeah. So yeah, you should bring that one in.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Come join our Lovecraft class.
Yeah.
Actually, that could be fun. Maybe we bring Gabriel on here for an episode and we talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it would be cool to get if Gabriel wanted to walk us through some of the interesting adaptations, whether game and film alike, where he sees these kind of elements coming in. That'd be fun.
Yeah, we're doing 3 at the end. So I'm doing all the TV, film, and some radio, and he's doing some radio and some gaming. So we could bring that in. That'd be good fun.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Okay. Cool.
Neat.
All right, we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. See you guys soon. Bye now.
Bye.